This is my true story. I raised 9 sons under one roof, fed them with hands that worked until the skin split, and taught them to carry my name with pride. But greed has a way of blinding even blood. When age bent my back, they started counting what I owned instead of what I'd given. And when I fell ill, they didn't weep. They waited. They shut my coffin, laughed, and walked away believing I'd finally left them everything. They were wrong. Before I tell you how I stood at their door 3 days later, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so more people hear my story. I was never a rich man when I started. Only a worker with calloused hands and a spine made of stubbornness. Every brick, every nail, every crop in the soil came from sweat that could have drowned a weaker man. I built a roof before I built comfort. I raised 9 boys in that house. 9 mouths, 9 tempers, 9 versions of my own blood that I thought would one day carry my name with pride. Each one took their first step while I held the wall steady. Each one learned to stand while I broke my back to keep them upright. When their mother died, I didn't break. I cooked, cleaned, worked double shifts, and still made it home before dark so they wouldn't feel her absence. I was father and mother both, the kind of man who forgot what rest felt like. When shoes tore, I patched them. When hunger came, I ate last. I didn't build an empire. I built a foundation. The family name, the house, the savings, all of it came from years that no one thanked me for. But I didn't mind. Love was enough. I thought blood was loyalty. As the years passed, my sons became men, and men forget easily. They forgot the nights I sat awake counting coins for their school fees. They forgot the winters I worked with fever just to keep the lights on. They forgot that the roof over their heads was once held up by my own hands. They began to see my age as weakness, not wisdom. They stopped asking for advice, stopped listening, stopped calling unless they needed something signed. One by one, they left home, chasing their own names, but never once building anything of their own. When I grew old, the visits turned into obligations. They'd drop by, carrying fake smiles and louder opinions. They spoke over me at my own table, laughed about old stories, and treated my memories like punchlines. The house that once rang with laughter now echoed with mockery. I was no longer the father they feared or respected. I was the inconvenience they were waiting to outlive. Still, I gave. I lent money. I covered their mistakes. When one gambled, I paid the debt. When another lost his home, I gave him mine. I told myself family was family, that maybe my kindness would remind them of where they came from. But greed doesn't remember kindness. It only waits for opportunity. The day my health began to fail, they circled like crows. They came not with flowers or care, but with questions. Questions about the will, the land, the accounts. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own blood, plan my ending like businessmen negotiating a deal. "It's only fair we split it evenly," one said. "He'd want that," another lied. They didn't see the old man lying there. They saw the property, the bank, the future they thought was theirs by right. I wanted to shout, to curse, to remind them who built everything they were now counting. But I stayed silent, because anger burns fast, and I wanted something that burned slow. Something they'd never forget. So I started watching, listening. I watched which son smiled when I coughed, which one flinched when the doctor said, "Not long," and which one whispered, "Finally." That's when I knew. The house I built was no longer a home. It was a waiting room for betrayal. And when the time came, I didn't fight it. I let them believe what they wanted to believe, that I was dying, that the end was close, that soon the old man's hands would stop holding everything together. They thought they were counting down my final days. But I was counting theirs, the days left until they'd learn what kind of man they'd buried alive. Cruelty doesn't start with shouting, it starts with laughter. The kind that sounds harmless, but cuts deeper than knives. It began small, jokes about my hearing, about the way I moved slower than before. They'd snicker when I dropped a spoon, trade glances when I repeated a question. "You're getting old, Dad," they'd say, smiling like it was affection. But their tone carried something colder, pity wrapped in disrespect. I let it slide. I told myself they were just being young, that maybe I was too sensitive. But every laugh chipped away at the man who had once built their world. The house I built became their stage. They'd arrive for dinners, loud and careless, bringing bottles instead of gratitude. They'd sit around my table, the same one I made by hand, and fill the room with arrogance. Conversations turned into competition. Who earned more? Who drove the better car? Who would get what when I was gone? They thought I couldn't hear the jokes. But I did. Every single one. "The old man's living forever," one said once. "Maybe we should help him move it along." The laughter that followed still rings in my head. I stopped trying to join their conversations. They didn't want my stories. They wanted reminders of how far they'd moved beyond me. The boys who once sat at my feet now rolled their eyes when I spoke. When I asked for help fixing a leak in the roof, they laughed. "You still trying to fix things, Dad?" one of them said. "You should rest before you fall apart yourself." Another chimed in. "Don't worry, we'll take care of the house when you're gone." Then they all laughed. My sons, the men I had raised to protect, not prey. One night, it got worse. My health had started slipping again. I called them together, all 9, thinking maybe if they saw me weak, they'd remember compassion. I made their favorite stew, set the table, and waited. They came late, already half drunk. I spoke about unity, about how family should stay strong when storms come. One of them leaned back in his chair and said, "You're talking like you're about to give a speech at your own funeral." The others laughed. I didn't. I just stared at them. 9 faces that carried my features, but none of my heart. When dinner ended, they stayed behind, drinking more, talking louder. I went to my room, too tired to argue. I could hear them through the thin walls, their voices low, joking again. "He'll probably leave everything to charity," one said. "Then we'll fight for years." "Nah," another replied. "He's too predictable. He'll split it evenly." The old man's fair to a fault. Then came the sentence that sealed it all. "Doesn't matter. Once he's gone, it's all ours anyway." And then, laughter. Long, unfiltered laughter. I sat in the dark, staring at my hands. The same hands that had held them when they cried, built the roof above their heads, worked in freezing winters to keep food on their plates. My chest burned, not from sickness, from realization. They didn't love me. They tolerated me because I still had something left to give. After that night, the house felt smaller, colder. When I walked through it, their laughter seemed to linger like a haunting. Even when they weren't there, I could still hear it. In the hallways, in the kitchen, even near my bed. That sound had replaced the warmth that once filled these walls. When my health finally collapsed and the doctor said it might be time to prepare, my sons didn't cry. They gathered again, not in sorrow, but in convenience. They spoke about funerals, wills, logistics. They called it handling things. I lay there, listening to them, pretending to drift away. But my mind was wide awake. That was the night one of them whispered near my bedside, thinking I was too far gone to hear. "Finally, it's over." And then they laughed again. That was when I decided I'd give them what they wanted, a death to celebrate. But not the ending they expected. The day they buried me was bright, almost cruelly so. Sunlight spilled over the field like it was mocking the darkness they had wished on me. The church smelled of lilies and polished wood, but under all that perfume, I could still smell their greed. I lay still, eyes closed beneath the lid, and listened. My sons, 9 men I once called blessings, spoke in hollow voices, reading words they didn't mean. "He was a great father," one said, his voice steady like a salesman rehearsing a pitch. "He gave us everything," another added, and the rest nodded, fighting smiles they couldn't hide. They thought the dead couldn't hear, but I heard it all. Every whisper, every snicker, every careless chuckle that cut through the pastor's prayers. One leaned toward another and murmured, "Guess we'll find out what he left us by tomorrow." They laughed. The sound crawled into my ears and stayed there. To them, I wasn't their father anymore. I was an inheritance waiting to be divided. They couldn't wait to start cutting me apart, piece by piece, name by name. I had spent nights preparing for this moment, not in fear but in quiet calculation. I had rehearsed my stillness, practiced the way breath disappears from the chest. When the illness came, I let them believe I was fading. I signed papers they didn't bother to read. I made calls they never questioned. By the time they placed me in that coffin, I had already rewritten the story they thought they were living in. The lid closed with a hollow thud, my son's final act of betrayal. Their laughter was muffled now, but I could still feel it vibrating through the wood. I imagined their faces above me, smug, relieved, already moving on. I pictured the glint in their eyes as they planned what to do with my house, my land, my savings. To them, this was not a funeral. It was an opening ceremony. And yet, under all their arrogance, I knew something they didn't. They were burying the only man who had ever protected them from themselves. Without me, they would soon find out how small and helpless greed becomes when there's no one left to control it. I wanted to laugh too, but instead, I breathed slow, almost smiling under the weight of their lies. The pastor's words faded into the distance. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. My sons faked tears. I could hear the effort in their sniffles. One of them even said, "He lived a long life." Another replied, "And now we can finally rest, too." Rest. As if my existence had been their burden. As if my care, my sacrifices, my roof, my food, my everything had been too heavy for their entitled shoulders. When the coffin was lowered, I felt the first handful of dirt land on the lid. Dull, final. And then another. Each sound reminded me of the years I'd spent working for them. The sound of shovels in earth became the rhythm of my memories. One strike for the time I patched their shoes, another for the nights I stayed awake feeding them, another for the mornings I left before sunrise to buy them a better future. They buried me in the ground, but what they were really burying was their own bloodline's last bit of honor. When the crowd thinned, I heard laughter again, this time louder, unrestrained. One of them, the eldest, said, "Guess the old man finally made it to peace." Another replied, "And left us in pieces, to share." More laughter. A third voice joined in. "He'd probably haunt us if he could." They didn't know how close they were to the truth. They left the graveyard with full stomachs and empty hearts, already drunk on victory. But while they slept that night, the world they thought they controlled began to change. Papers they never read were already moving through the right hands. Calls had already been made. The signatures were already sealed. By the time the dirt settled above my coffin, their inheritance was gone. And I was far from dead. Silence is a strange thing after death. It doesn't roar, it hums, steady, low, and patient. When they closed the coffin, they believed that silence meant the end. But mine was the beginning. Inside that stillness, I listened, not with ears, but with the kind of awareness that only betrayal sharpens. I could feel time passing, slow as the crawl of worms through the soil. I imagined their voices fading, their footsteps walking away from my grave, their relief blooming into laughter once they thought I was gone forever. And as that sound drifted farther, something inside me hardened. I had given them everything, and now I was free to take it back. They thought I would sleep peacefully under the ground, but I was wide awake beneath the weight of their arrogance. When the night came, I didn't dream. I remembered. I remembered their faces bent over the dinner table, whispering about how much I was worth. I remembered the smirk of the eldest as he joked that the will would finally pay off. I remembered the youngest turning his back when I called his name. Each memory stitched itself into a single thought. They buried me for money, so I will let money bury them. By morning, the legal gears I had set in motion began to turn. Long before that coffin was ever built, I had met with lawyers who didn't ask questions, men and women who had seen greed before and knew how to bind it with ink. I had rewritten my will, redirected every account, and transferred ownership of every property to a trust they would never control. The papers were timed, filed, and waiting. My fake death was the key that unlocked every clause. Once the death certificate was processed, every single asset they expected to inherit moved elsewhere, silently, efficiently, legally. I was still. But my plan was alive. While they drank and celebrated my passing, lawyers they'd never met began delivering quiet letters to the real heirs of my respect. People who had shown kindness when my own blood turned cold. The nurse who stayed late without asking for pay. The neighbor who fixed my fence in the rain. The foundation that helped children without fathers. They all received what my sons had thrown away without realizing it. Not just wealth, but dignity attached to my name. Meanwhile, my sons began their feast of delusion. They filled my house with voices, their wives with fake tears and hungry eyes. The rooms that once held warmth now echoed with greed. They opened drawers, ransacked closets, counted envelopes, searched for hidden safes. They even fought among themselves before the will was read. One of them claimed he deserved more because he was closest to me. Another laughed, saying, "Closest to taking his money, maybe." That night, they toasted my memory. Wine spilled. Greed swelled. And somewhere between their laughter and their lies, I smiled in the dark. Because I knew that every toast they made was to a future that would never come. 3 days passed. 3 long, quiet days where my plan settled like dust on a closed window. The world thought I was gone. Even the priest had finished his part and moved on. But silence can be the loudest answer. In that quiet, I felt no fear, only calm. They had buried a father, but what they didn't know was that they had awakened something far older and colder inside me. I wasn't seeking revenge anymore. I was seeking justice. Not the kind that needs shouting or blood. The kind that moves with the weight of law and the precision of time. So when the third dawn came, I rose. Not from the grave they thought I was in, but from the place I had been waiting all along. I stepped out into the morning light, the air sharp and alive, the world strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, I felt no burden. My sons had buried a man. But what was walking toward their door was something else entirely, a reckoning dressed in silence. While they drank away their guilt and argued over my non-existent fortune, the true work had already begun, quiet, deliberate, and invisible. Before the coffin was ever carved, I had spent months weaving a web of signatures, transfers, and legal knots that not even their greed could untie. It started with a whisper at my lawyer's office, a small, firm man with tired eyes and a sharper mind. I told him everything, not about my son's cruelty, but about my plan. He didn't flinch. He just said, "If you want peace, sir, make it legal." So I did. Together, we built a wall they couldn't climb, line by line, signature by signature. Every property they expected, I quietly retitled. Every account they assumed was waiting, I drained into foundations, charities, and trust funds for people who deserved them. Even the family house, the one they grew up in, I transferred to the church under one condition: it would serve as a home for orphans and widows after I was gone. The old place that once echoed with their selfish laughter would finally know peace again. I knew they'd never suspect it. They never paid attention to paperwork, never read fine print. They only saw what was in front of them: my frail hands, my quiet nature, my fading breath. They didn't know that every cough, every weary sigh, was part of a stage I'd been preparing for years. They believed they were waiting for my death, but I was waiting for their downfall. The coffin wasn't my prison. It was my disguise. I spent my last week before dying signing final documents, locking them in the hands of men I trusted more than my own children. I instructed them to wait exactly 72 hours after my funeral before activating the transfers. That way, by the time my sons began fighting over what was left, the law itself would already be holding their inheritance hostage. No drama, no confrontation, just precision, cold and perfect. When the coffin lid finally closed, I felt no fear. I'd already escaped them. I wasn't lying under that wood. I was lying in wait. My body had simply gone elsewhere, hidden, safe, cared for by people who knew the truth. The doctor they trusted? My doctor. The death certificate they signed? My lawyer's doing. Every piece of paper they used to celebrate my end was actually the proof of their own undoing. For the first time in years, I had silence. Real silence. No bickering. No greed. No voices calling me a burden. Just peace. And beneath that peace was power. The kind they would never understand. On the second day, my lawyer made his quiet calls. Titles shifted hands. Bank accounts moved. The inheritance they dreamed about melted like ice under sunlight. By the time the third day arrived, their empire was built on nothing but air, and that's when it was time for me to move again. I woke up early that morning, the air sharp and clear in my lungs. My body was weak, but my spirit felt 20 years younger. I put on the same old coat they used to mock, brushed my silver hair, and looked at my reflection. The man staring back wasn't the frail father they'd buried. He was someone else now, reborn, not from faith, but from betrayal. I folded the documents that proved everything into my coat pocket, deeds, letters, and a note written in my own hand. You taught me how to die. I taught you how to lose. Then, with a cane in one hand and resolve in the other, I started walking toward their house. My steps were slow but steady, each one echoing like a verdict. The sun was just rising, painting the street gold. Somewhere far away, church bells rang. They thought I was gone. But I was coming home, to teach 9 sons the meaning of consequence. By the time I reached their doorstep, the first wave of panic had already begun. The world moves faster than greed can think, and the law moves even faster when truth fuels it. My lawyer had done exactly as promised. Overnight, official envelopes landed in each of my sons' mailboxes. Heavy paper, sharp edges, embossed seals, the kind that smells like authority and finality. They tore them open expecting wealth, but what spilled out wasn't gold. It was justice, written in perfect legal ink. Every letter began the same. We regret to inform you that your claim to the estate of the late Mr. is invalid. The words were short, polite, and merciless. The bank accounts they believed were theirs now belonged to charities they had never heard of. The deeds to my land had been transferred, some to public trusts, some to schools, and one, my favorite, to the small church that had fed me when I was young and poor. Every dollar they had waited for had been erased from their names like chalk washed off a board. When they realized what was happening, confusion turned to fury. They called the lawyer's office, but the phones led to silence and voicemail. They drove to the bank, waving their letters, shouting my name at clerks who could only shrug and point at the seals. It was already done. The system didn't bend for tears or tantrums. It moved with quiet, unfeeling precision, exactly as I had planned. I can picture it even now. 9 grown men, faces pale with shock, pacing through their kitchens as they realized the truth. Their wives shouting questions, their voices breaking into arguments, old resentments boiling over. "He tricked us," one must have yelled. "He can't do this," another shouted. But I could, and I did. Every laugh they gave me at that coffin came back now in the sound of their panic. That morning, they met at my house, their inheritance. The same place they had joked about turning into a vacation home. The locks had already been changed. A security guard, hired by the new owners, met them at the gate and handed them another envelope. Inside, a letter in my handwriting waited for them. It said, "To my sons, you buried me with laughter. Consider this my reply. The world you tried to take now belongs to those who never took from me. Remember, a house built on greed always collapses. Father." I imagined the silence that followed. 9 men standing outside the gates of a home that was no longer theirs, holding a letter from the father they'd mocked into the grave. Inside the house, my portrait still hung above the fireplace. I had left it there intentionally. I wanted them to see my eyes watching from the wall, calm, steady, eternal. They could tear up the letter, curse my name, scream at the air. It wouldn't matter. The papers were already stamped, the transactions locked, the signatures unchangeable. I didn't take their money to punish them. I took it to prove a point. That legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. And none of them had earned a thing. As the day went on, the panic spread among them like wildfire. They called one another, each hoping someone had good news. None did. Their voices cracked with disbelief, denial, and eventually silence. The kind of silence that only comes when pride finally meets its limit. I was already on my way. Cane tapping on the road, heart steady, I made my slow walk toward the house. By then, the last thing they expected to see was me, alive, breathing, real. To them, I was a ghost haunting their conscience. But what was coming to their door wasn't a ghost. It was their father, the same man they buried with laughter, now walking back to reclaim the only thing left that mattered, his dignity. Because sometimes the cruelest punishment isn't the grave, it's the knock that follows it. The morning I walked back to their house, the sky was the same color it had been the day they buried me. Pale gold, quiet, merciless. I could smell the earth, damp from last night's rain, the same earth they had shoveled over my coffin with laughter. Every step I took toward that door felt heavier than the last, but not from weakness, from justice, from years of silence finally about to speak. My cane struck the cobblestones in rhythm, each tap echoing like a heartbeat, slow, certain, alive. From a distance I saw them through the window, my 9 sons, still in the house they no longer owned. Their voices rose and fell, sharp with panic. Papers were scattered across the table. My letters, the legal notices, the documents they had spent hours trying to undo. Their faces were pale, drawn tight like men who had seen ghosts. And perhaps, in a way, they had. I stopped at the gate, my gate, and looked up at the house. The home I had built with my own hands now stood like a stranger's fortress. The windows glinted like cold eyes. The laughter that once filled these walls had turned into confusion and fear. I took a breath that tasted like closure, adjusted my coat, and pushed the gate open. The hinges groaned softly, a sound that cut through the quiet street. Inside, they must have heard it. The faint creak, the slow steps approaching. One of them shouted, "Who's there?" His voice cracked in a way that made me almost smile. I didn't answer. The cane kept tapping, steady, nearer. Another voice, lower, nervous, said, "It's probably the lawyer again." Then silence. My hand reached the door. I knocked. 3 slow knocks. The sound rang through the house. For a long second, no one moved. Then, cautious footsteps. The door opened, just a crack at first. A face appeared, and the color drained from it instantly. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His eyes widened, trembling in disbelief. I said nothing. I simply stood there, alive, breathing, solid. The man at the door stumbled back, whispering, It can't be." But it was. The others rushed in behind him. One dropped his coffee cup. Another pressed his hand to his chest, as if to check if his heart was still beating. I could see it in their faces. Every sin, every cruel laugh, every greedy thought flashing before their eyes. To them, I wasn't a father anymore. I was the consequence they thought they'd buried. I stepped over the threshold. My cane touched the floor of my own home, and for a moment, the house itself seemed to remember me. The air changed, heavier, quieter, like it was holding its breath. I looked at each of them. They stood in a row, 9 grown men suddenly reduced to frightened boys again. Their mouths opened, searching for words that didn't exist. I could see guilt sweating through their skin. "You thought the dead don't knock," I finally said, my voice calm, almost gentle. "But I never died." I just watched. Not one of them spoke. Not one dared to move. I walked past them, slow, steady, until I reached the table. The papers they'd been arguing over were still there. My will, the rejection letters, the final notices. I placed my hand on them, then looked up. "Everything you touched, everything you waited for, gone. Not by anger, by truth." One of them, the eldest, finally broke. "Father, we thought—" I raised a hand. "Don't. You didn't think. You took. You laughed. You buried me before my time and called it love." The room fell silent again. All I could hear was the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the same one that had measured their childhood, now counting down their shame. I turned toward the door. "I came to see your faces once more," I said softly, "to make sure you understood. I left you nothing, not because I hated you, but because you left me nothing long before the coffin closed." Their eyes followed me as I walked out. None dared stop me. None could. Outside, the sun was rising higher, bright and clean. I took one final look back at the house and smiled. Justice doesn't always wear a robe or carry a gavel. Sometimes it just carries a cane. The silence that followed my words was heavier than any tomb. 9 sons stood frozen before me, eyes wide, lips trembling, the color draining from their faces like sand slipping through fingers. You could have heard a tear hit the floor. I didn't need to raise my voice. The air itself carried my presence, the weight of the truth they'd buried with me. For a long moment, no one moved. They just stared, blinking like they were trying to decide whether I was a ghost or a nightmare come to life. Then the eldest, always the loudest, always the one who believed himself in charge, found his tongue. "This isn't possible," he muttered, half to himself. His voice cracked. "We buried you. We saw you go into the ground." I met his eyes and said quietly, "And you laughed." That single sentence made the room break. One of them gasped and backed away, hitting a chair. Another started whispering to himself, crossing and uncrossing his arms like a frightened child. The youngest, who had been the cruelest in secret, fell to his knees, clutching his head. Their fear was almost tangible, not because I had come back, but because everything they had done, every greedy word, every mocking smile, now stood before them, alive, breathing, unshakable. "I told you," one of them stammered to his brother. "We shouldn't have joked that night." "Quiet!" the eldest barked, but his voice lacked command. He turned back to me, eyes darting toward the door like he might run. "If this is a trick, it's not a trick," I said, my tone low, steady, calm like winter wind. "It's the truth you buried under laughter." No one dared reply. I could feel their shame filling the space where arrogance once lived. The same mouths that had mocked me at my deathbed couldn't even form words now. And I didn't need them to. Their silence was confession enough. On the table beside me, the official envelopes lay open, the papers they had refused to believe. I picked one up, the seal still intact, and slid it across the table toward them. "Read it," I said. The eldest hesitated, then opened it again, hands trembling. His eyes moved over the words, and when he reached the final line, he stopped breathing for a second. "It says," his voice faltered, "it says the assets have been redirected, permanently." "Correct," I said softly. "Redirected, away from greed, toward goodness." One of the others shouted, desperate now. "You can't do that. You can't just give everything away." I turned to him slowly. "Can't I?" It was mine. "You decided I was better dead than alive. You buried me before my heart stopped beating. Tell me, what right did you think you had after that?" No one answered. I looked at each of them. The sons I had raised, the boys who once clung to my legs, the men who had forgotten what love meant. Their faces blurred together, not from tears, but from the numbness that comes when truth cuts too deep. I walked toward the window, sunlight washing over my hands. "You had your chance," I said quietly. 9 men born of the same father, and not one remembered what family means. Behind me, one of them whispered, "We thought you were gone." I turned my head slightly. "You buried me alive in your hearts long before you put me in that box." A chair scraped. One of them fell into it, head in his hands. Another began pacing like a trapped animal. The eldest just stared at me, jaw clenched, eyes wet with something that looked like regret, but felt too late. I could have shouted. I could have thrown their cruelty back at them in full. But revenge, shouted, loses power. Justice whispers. So I simply said, "I came here to return what you gave me." Silence. "You'll live with it now. Every time you walk past this house, every time you remember my name, you'll hear the sound of your own laughter echoing back. And you'll know what it cost you." I reached the doorway, pausing for one final look. You closed my coffin, I said softly, but I closed your future. And with that, I stepped outside. The air hit my face like freedom. Behind me, 9 sons sat surrounded by broken pride and useless paper. The door creaked shut between us, sealing the sound of their shock inside forever. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits down at the table, and simply refuses to leave. That morning, it wore my face. When I stepped back into the sunlight, I didn't look like a man who had returned from death. I looked like a man who had finally buried his disappointment. Behind that door, my 9 sons sat with their mouths closed for once in their lives, staring at a truth that no argument could undo. There were no fists thrown, no shouting matches, no wild curses thrown at heaven, just silence. The kind of silence that follows when pride finally collapses under its own weight. I didn't need to see them anymore. The reckoning was already complete. I had given them something far worse than punishment: consequence. The papers had done their work better than any sermon or slap ever could. Their bank accounts would empty themselves without warning. Their cars would be repossessed. Their houses, built on borrowed arrogance, would fall back into the hands of the law. Bit by bit, they would learn how it feels to build something with their own hands, or lose everything trying. I walked slowly down the road, Cain tapping beside me, every step measured, calm. The neighbors watched from their porches, eyes wide. Some whispered prayers. Others crossed themselves, not knowing whether to believe what they were seeing. An old man they had buried 3 days ago, now walking like the past itself, had changed its mind. I didn't stop to explain. I owed no one an explanation. Let them wonder. Let my sons explain to the world how they had buried their own father too soon. The reckoning had no fire or thunder, just ink, silence, and the truth. That's all I ever needed. Because power doesn't come from wealth or revenge. It comes from the peace of knowing you are right. For years, I let them make me feel small, useless, unwanted. But walking away that day, I realized I had never lost power. I had just stopped using it. I had left them the lessons they refused to learn when I was alive. Each one written in contracts, sealed with law, delivered with precision. The oldest, who mocked my caution, would soon learn what it means to read before signing. The second, who gambled his future away, would learn how it feels to lose something you never truly earned. The youngest, who always whispered behind my back, would discover that words can cut deeper than knives, especially when they come back to haunt you. I didn't take joy in it. There was no laughter in my heart, only quiet satisfaction, not from vengeance, but from balance. The universe has a way of setting the table right when you finally stop trying to fix it with your bare hands. I had spent my whole life building, mending, forgiving. Now the world itself would do the rest. When I reached the small hill overlooking the town, I stopped and turned back. From there, I could see the house. My house, now a charity home in progress. Workers were already walking the yard, measuring, planning, preparing to turn it into something good. I smiled. The laughter that once filled that house would now be replaced by the sound of children playing, of prayers whispered before meals, of gratitude, something my own blood had forgotten long ago. I looked up at the sky, bright, endless, unbothered. "It's done," I whispered. No lightning struck. No voice answered. But I didn't need one. The peace I felt was enough. Because sometimes the loudest victory is the quiet one, when you don't have to raise your hand or voice to prove a point. You just walk away knowing you were right all along. The world will tell stories of revenge, of anger, of fathers who struck back. But that's not my story. My story is about a man who gave his sons everything, even the chance to bury him, and still came back standing taller than before. They will live long lives, but they will never forget the sound of my cane at their door. I often think about that morning. The light, the silence, the look on their faces when the dead came home. It doesn't haunt me. It humbles me. Life has a cruel rhythm. The hands that feed are often the ones bitten first, and the hearts that forgive are the ones broken last. But I've learned something in my years. The world doesn't remember kindness shouted, only dignity kept. That's why I didn't curse them, didn't raise my voice, didn't demand anything. I simply lived, and living, after they buried me, became my loudest answer. I walk with peace now. The bitterness that once clouded my chest has turned to stillness. I rent a small room near the edge of town, overlooking a field I used to take them to when they were young. From there, I can see the house every morning, the one they lost, the one that's no longer theirs. I hear laughter there again sometimes, but it's not cruel, it's soft. Children play in the yard where my sons once plotted greed. Widows cook meals in the kitchen that used to smell of my wife's bread. The house breathes again, not as a monument to what was taken, but as proof of what was saved. Sometimes I imagine my sons walking past it, eyes lowered, hearts heavy with the ghosts of their own making. Maybe they curse my name, maybe they pray to me, maybe they just stay silent, afraid of what memory might answer back. That's fine. I didn't come back for their forgiveness. I came back for mine. I needed to see them, to prove to myself that my kindness hadn't been weakness, that my patience hadn't been wasted. And when I saw their faces twist with fear, I didn't feel triumph. I felt closure. Because now they finally understood. Not what I'd lost, but who I'd been all along. People ask what justice feels like. It doesn't feel like fire. It feels like calm. It's the steady breath you take when you know you don't need to explain yourself anymore. For years, I wondered why God let me live long enough to be betrayed by my own children. Now I know. He wanted me to outlive their lies. He wanted me to see the laughter die in their throats. I think of their mother often. She would have wept to see what they became. But I like to think she's at peace now too, watching as the home she loved becomes a sanctuary again. I can almost hear her voice in the wind, whispering, "You did right." I don't visit their homes. I don't answer their letters, the few they dared to send after the dust settled. Apologies written in expensive ink can't fix what was broken in their souls. They buried me once. I buried their entitlement forever. We're even. Some nights, I light a candle and sit by the window. The flame dances, small and stubborn, refusing to die even when the wind presses against it. That's what I became. A flicker that refused to go out when everyone thought it had. I smile when I think of it that way. My sons gave me a coffin. I gave them a lifetime to remember what they lost. Time moves quietly now. My hands are weaker, but my heart feels lighter than it has in decades. I used to fear dying alone. But after what happened, I realized something powerful. Dying alone isn't the tragedy. Living surrounded by people who wish you gone is. So I walk this final stretch in peace, not vengeance. The world thinks resurrection is a miracle. I think it's a choice. The decision to rise when everyone's written you off. I once believed legacy meant what you leave behind. Now I know it's what refuses to be buried. Final line. They closed my coffin and laughed. 3 days later, I knocked, and their laughter died in their throats.